There is a place in the American Southwest where the fate of an entire civilization is written on the walls of a canyon, measured in a pale band of bleached rock that grows a little taller with each passing year. It is the largest reservoir in the United States, a vast body of water held back by one of the most famous structures ever built. And it sits at the heart of a system that sustains the lives of tens of millions of people across a sprawling, sun-scorched region that has no business supporting so many. This is Lake Mead, and the great artery of water that fills it. The Colorado River is the lifeline of the modern Southwest. For most of the last century, that lifeline held. The water came, the reservoir filled, the cities grew, and the desert bloomed with a green never intended. But something has changed, something deep and structural and frightening, and it is becoming impossible to ignore. The system that everything depends on is beginning to fail. The Lake Mead River, the great river that feeds the reservoir and defines the region, is starting to break. To say that it is starting to break is not hyperbole, and it is not the language of distant alarm. It is a description of what is happening right now, of a slow-moving crisis that has been building for years and that is now reaching a point of genuine danger. The reservoir has fallen to levels once thought nearly impossible, exposing shorelines submerged for generations and dropping toward thresholds below which the entire system begins to malfunction. The river that feeds it has been delivering less and less water, its flows diminished by a combination of forces that show no sign of reversing, and the elaborate arrangement of laws and agreements and infrastructure that was built to divide and deliver that water. An arrangement that assumed the river would always provide is straining under the weight of a reality it was never designed to handle. This is what it means for a great water system to break, not a single dramatic moment of collapse, but a gradual, grinding failure of the assumptions on which everything was built. In this video, we are going to understand exactly what is happening to Lake Mead and the river that sustains it, and why it matters far beyond the borders of the desert Southwest. We are going to explore how this extraordinary system was built, the audacious dream of taming a wild river and using it to make the desert habitable for millions. We are going to understand the flaw at the very heart of the arrangement, the fundamental miscalculation that promised more water than the river could ever reliably provide. We are going to look at the great drying that has gripped the region, the long decline in the river's flows, and the forces driving it. We are going to descend, in our imagination, down the falling waterline of the reservoir, past the bathtub ring and toward the dangerous thresholds that lie below, and we are going to understand what happens to the water supply and the electricity in the whole region if those thresholds are crossed. We are going to meet the tens of millions of people whose lives depend on this water, the farms that feed the nation, the cities that have grown in the desert. And we are going to confront the bitter question of who loses first when there is not enough to go around. And we are going to ask whether the system can be saved, whether the breaking can be halted, and what it would take. Stay with us, because the story of the Lake Mead River is one of the most important stories of our time, a story about the limits of what human beings can demand from nature, and about what happens when a lifeline built for one world is forced to serve another. Hashtag the river, the dam, and the reservoir. Before we can understand how the system is breaking, we have to understand what it actually is, because the words Lake Mead and the Colorado River describe not a simple lake and stream, but an immense and intricate machine for capturing, storing, and distributing water across an entire region. At the center of it all is the river itself, the Colorado, a great watercourse that gathers the snowmelt and rain of a vast territory and carries it across the arid heart of the West. For countless ages, this river ran wild and free, sometimes raging with flood, sometimes shrinking in drought, carving the deepest canyons on the continent and providing a ribbon of life through an otherwise merciless desert. It was a river of extremes, unpredictable and untamed, and for most of history, it flowed all the way to the sea, emptying into the Gulf far to the south. Then came the dam. In one of the great engineering feats of the modern age, a colossal wall of concrete was raised across a deep canyon of the Colorado, an undertaking so ambitious that it seemed to defy the very idea of what human beings could accomplish. This dam, one of the most famous structures ever built, was designed to tame the wild river, to hold back its floods and store its water, to generate electricity from its power, and to make possible the settlement and development of a region that had always been too dry to support large populations. When the dam was completed and its gates closed, the river began to back up behind it, filling the canyons upstream, rising higher and higher over the years until it formed an enormous reservoir, the largest in the country. A body of water so vast that it transformed the geography of the region. This reservoir is Lake Mead. It is important to understand what a reservoir like this actually does, because it is the key to the whole system. A river, left to itself, delivers its water unevenly, in floods and trickles, in wet years and dry, with no regard for the needs of the people who might depend on it. A great reservoir changes that entirely. By capturing the water and holding it, the reservoir smooths out the river's wild variations, storing the abundance of the wet years to carry the region through the dry ones. It becomes a giant savings account of water, a buffer against the river's unpredictability, allowing a steady and reliable supply to be drawn from an inherently unreliable source. This storage is what made the modern Southwest possible, because it meant that the cities and farms could count on the water arriving when they needed it, regardless of what the river was doing in any given season. The reservoir is the heart of the system, the great regulator that turns a wild river into a dependable resource. From this reservoir and the system it anchors, the water is distributed across an enormous region, carried through canals and aqueducts and pipelines to the cities and farms that depend on it, and used along the way to generate the electricity that powers homes and industries. The water of the Colorado, captured and stored and divided, sustains a population of tens of millions across multiple states, irrigates vast areas of farmland that produce a significant share of the nation's food, and enables the existence of major cities and places that could never have supported them otherwise. It is, in the truest sense, the lifeblood of the region, the single resource on which nearly everything else depends. And Lake Mead, the great reservoir at the center of it all, is the visible symbol and the beating heart of the entire arrangement, its water level a kind of gauge measuring the health of the whole system. When Lake Mead is full, the system is healthy. When Lake Mead falls, the system is in trouble. And Lake Mead has been falling. Hashtag what it means for the system to break. When we say that the Lake Mead River is starting to break, we are describing something specific and serious, and it is worth being precise about what that breaking actually involves, because it is not a single event, but a convergence of failures across the whole system. A great water system like this one is built on a set of assumptions, and it functions as long as those assumptions hold. The breaking is what happens when reality diverges so far from the assumptions that the system can no longer do what it was designed to do, when the gap between what was promised and what the river can deliver grows too large to bridge. The most visible dimension of the breaking is the falling level of the reservoir itself. Lake Mead was designed to hold an enormous quantity of water, and for much of its history it held a deep and reassuring reserve. But over the years of decline, the reservoir has dropped dramatically, falling to levels far below what was once considered normal, exposing a growing expanse of the canyon walls that had long been underwater. This falling level is the clearest sign of the crisis, a visible measure of the growing imbalance between what flows in and what is drawn out. When more water is taken from the reservoir than the river delivers to it, the level falls, and it has been falling for a long time. A steady decline that reflects the fundamental deficit at the heart of the system. But the falling level is not just a symbolic concern, because as the reservoir drops, it approaches thresholds that carry real and serious consequences. There are levels below which the generation of electricity becomes impaired, because the machinery that produces power depends on the water being high enough to drive it. There are levels below which the delivery of water becomes more difficult, as the intakes that draw the water toward the canals approach the shrinking surface. And there is, at the bottom, a level so low that water can no longer pass through the dam at all, a point at which the reservoir becomes effectively unusable as a source of supply. As the reservoir falls toward these thresholds, the breaking of the system moves from the abstract to the concrete, from a worrying trend to an imminent danger. The breaking also involves the failure of the human arrangements built around the river, the elaborate structure of laws and agreements that divides the water among the many parties who depend on it. This structure was created on the basis of certain assumptions about how much water the river would provide, and it allocated that water accordingly, promising specific quantities to the various states and users. But as the river has delivered less and less, the promises have come to exceed the supply, and the careful arrangement has begun to strain and crack under the pressure. The rules that were supposed to govern the sharing of abundance are now being forced to govern the sharing of scarcity, a task for which they were never designed. And the result is conflict, uncertainty, and the growing possibility that the whole framework could break down. This is perhaps the deepest and most dangerous dimension of the breaking, because without a functioning agreement on how to share a shrinking resource, the region faces the prospect of a chaotic scramble for water in which everyone loses. So when we speak of the Lake Mead River starting to break, we mean all of this at once: the falling reservoir, the approaching thresholds, the straining agreements, the growing gap between promise and reality. It is a systemic breaking, a failure that spreads across every part of the arrangement, and it is starting now, unfolding in real time. Visible in the bleached rock of the canyon walls and in the anxious negotiations of the people who must decide how to divide what remains. Understanding this breaking is the first step toward grasping the magnitude of the crisis and toward seeing why it matters so much for the millions of people whose lives are bound up with this water. Hashtag the audacious dream that built it all. To understand the crisis of the present, we have to appreciate the extraordinary ambition of the past, the audacious dream that led human beings to build this system in the first place, because the seeds of the current breaking were planted in the very moment of its creation. The taming of the Colorado River and the settlement of the desert Southwest represent one of the boldest undertakings in the history of the nation, a deliberate effort to remake an entire region, to impose human order on a wild landscape, and to make the desert support a civilization it could never have sustained on its own. The vision was breathtaking in its scope. Here was a vast region of the West, rich in sunshine and land and potential, but cursed with a fundamental scarcity of water. And here was a great river, running through the heart of that region, carrying an enormous quantity of water that mostly flowed, unused, all the way to the sea. The dream was to capture that water, to hold it and control it and put it to work, to irrigate the desert and power the cities, and enable a great expansion of human settlement across a landscape that had always resisted it. It was a dream of conquest, of the triumph of human ingenuity over the constraints of nature, and it captured the imagination of a generation that believed there was no obstacle that could not be overcome with enough vision and effort. The building of the Great Dam was the centerpiece of this dream, and it was an achievement of staggering proportions. To raise a wall of concrete tall enough and strong enough to hold back a great river in a remote and forbidding canyon under conditions of brutal heat and enormous difficulty required an effort of extraordinary scale and daring. It stood, when completed, as a monument to human ambition. The dam did not just hold back water. It embodied an entire philosophy, a conviction that nature could be mastered and bent to human purposes, that the desert could be made to bloom, that the constraints of a harsh environment could be engineered away. And for a long time, the dream seemed to be working spectacularly well. The dam rose, the reservoir filled, and the water it stored and delivered transformed the region beyond recognition. Deserts that had been empty and dry became productive farmland. Cities that had been small and constrained by their lack of water began to grow explosively, their populations swelling as the reliable supply removed the ancient limit on their expansion. The whole region flourished, its prosperity built on the foundation of the great system that had tamed the Colorado. The dream had delivered, or so it appeared, and for decades the abundance seemed limitless, the water seemed inexhaustible, and the triumph over nature seemed complete. But within this triumph lay a hidden flaw, a fundamental miscalculation that would eventually bring the whole system to the point of breaking. The dream had been built on an assumption about how much water the river would reliably provide, and that assumption, it would turn out, was dangerously optimistic. The very success of the system, the growth and prosperity it enabled, had been built on a foundation that was, in a deep sense, unsound, a promise of abundance that the river was never truly able to keep. And as the years passed and the reality of the river's limits became clear, that hidden flaw would begin to reveal itself, and the audacious dream would begin, slowly, to unravel. Hashtag, the flaw at the heart of the system, at the very core of the crisis, lies a miscalculation so fundamental that it undermines the entire arrangement, a flaw built into the foundation of the system from the beginning. And understanding it is essential to understanding why the breaking was, in a sense, inevitable. The problem, put simply, is that the system promises more water than the river can reliably provide. The elaborate structure of allocations that divides the Colorado's water among the various states and users was based on an estimate of the river's flow, and that estimate was too high, so that the total quantity of water promised to everyone exceeds the amount the river actually delivers in a typical year. This came about because the foundational agreements that divided the river's water were made during a period when the river happened to be running unusually high, a stretch of especially wet years that gave a misleadingly generous picture of how much water the river typically carried. Working from the flows of that abnormally abundant period, the people who divided the water assumed a level of supply that the river, over the longer run, could not maintain, dividing up a quantity that existed on paper but not, in most years, in the actual river. The result was a system in which the sum of all the promises exceeded the reality of the supply, a structural over-allocation baked into the very foundation of the arrangement. For a long time, this flaw was hidden, its consequences deferred, because the system had a buffer that concealed the imbalance. The great reservoirs, above all Lake Mead, held enormous quantities of stored water, a vast reserve accumulated during the wetter years, and this stored water masked the underlying deficit, when the river delivered less than was promised. The difference could be made up by drawing down the reservoirs, dipping into the accumulated savings to meet the demands. As long as the reservoirs remained high, the over-allocation did not bite, because the stored water covered the gap. The system appeared to be working, the promises appeared to be honored, and the fundamental imbalance remained invisible, hidden beneath the surface of the great reservoirs. But a buffer can only last so long, and drawing down a reserve to cover a persistent deficit is a strategy with a built-in expiration date. Every year that the river delivered less than was promised, the reservoirs fell a little further, the accumulated savings dwindled, and the day of reckoning drew nearer. The overallocation was a structural imbalance that guaranteed the reservoirs would decline over time, slowly during the years when the deficit was small, more rapidly when the river ran especially low. And as the reservoirs fell, the hidden flaw would eventually be exposed, and the system would be forced to confront the reality that it had promised more than the river could give. This is the flaw at the heart of the breaking, the original miscalculation that made the crisis, sooner or later, unavoidable. What makes this flaw so intractable is that correcting it requires taking water away from someone, and no one wants to be the one to give it up. The over-allocation means that the total demands must be reduced to match the real supply. But every unit of water is claimed by someone who depends on it, a farm, a city, a state, an industry, and reducing the allocations means imposing real losses on real people who have built their lives and livelihoods around the water they were promised. This is why the flaw has proven so difficult to fix, because fixing it means distributing pain, deciding who must lose. And every party naturally resists being the one to bear the cost. The flaw at the heart of the system is not just a technical error, but a political and human dilemma, and it is this dilemma that the breaking is now forcing to a head. Hashtag, the Great Drying. If the over-allocation set the stage for the crisis, it is the Great Drying of the region that has brought the crisis to a head. The long and deepening decline in the water available to the system that has turned a latent flaw into an active emergency. For years now, the flows of the Colorado River have been diminishing, delivering less water to the reservoirs than they once did, and this sustained reduction in supply has accelerated the decline of Lake Mead and pushed the whole system toward the point of breaking. Understanding this drying and the forces behind it is essential to grasping why the crisis has become so severe and why it shows no sign of easing. The most immediate cause of the drying is drought, an extended period of below normal precipitation and reduced flows that has gripped the region for a long stretch of years. The Colorado River depends heavily on the snow that accumulates in the high mountains of its watershed during the winter, snow that melts in the spring and summer and runs off into the river, feeding the flows that fill the reservoirs. When the winters bring less snow, or when the snow that does fall melts and runs off less efficiently, the river receives less water and the reservoirs decline. The region has been experiencing exactly this kind of extended drought, a dry period of unusual length and severity that has starved the river of its accustomed supply. But the drying is not simply a matter of drought in the ordinary sense, because there is growing reason to believe that something deeper and more permanent is at work, a fundamental shift in the climate of the region toward hotter and drier conditions. As temperatures rise, the effects ripple through the entire water system in ways that reduce the flow of the river beyond what reduced precipitation alone would explain. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation, pulling water from the reservoirs and the soil and the snowpack into the air. They mean that more of the precipitation that does fall is lost before it can reach the river, absorbed by thirstier soils and vegetation or evaporated away. They mean that the snowpack melts earlier and less completely, altering the timing and the quantity of the runoff. The warming, in other words, acts as a kind of amplifier, intensifying the effects of the drought and reducing the river's flow even further, and because the warming is a long-term trend rather than a passing phase. It suggests that the drying may be not a temporary misfortune, but a lasting new condition. This distinction is crucial because it changes the entire nature of the problem. If the drying were simply a drought, a temporary run of dry years, then the appropriate response would be to endure it, to draw on the reserves and wait for the wet years to return and refill the reservoirs. Droughts end, and the system was designed to weather them. But if the drying is instead a permanent shift, a lasting reduction in the amount of water the river can provide, then the reserves will not be refilled. The wet years will not return in their old abundance, and the deficit will not be a temporary trial, but a permanent reality to be accommodated. The evidence increasingly points toward this more troubling interpretation, toward a future in which the river simply carries less water than it did in the past, in which the abundance on which the whole system was built is gone for good. The great drying, then, is the force that has transformed the crisis from a distant possibility into a present danger. It has accelerated the decline of the reservoirs, drained the buffer that had concealed the overallocation, and exposed the fundamental imbalance between the promises and the supply. It has taken a system that was already promising more than the river could reliably provide and reduced the river's provision even further, widening the gap and hastening the day of reckoning. And because it appears to be driven in significant part by the long-term warming of the climate, it offers little hope of a natural reversal, little prospect that the region can simply wait out the dry spell and return to the old abundance. The drying is the reason the breaking is happening now, and its apparent permanence is the reason the breaking is so difficult to stop. Descending the falling waterline to truly grasp the crisis. It helps to imagine descending the falling waterline of Lake Mead, following the decline of the reservoir from the high marks of its fuller days down toward the dangerous thresholds that lie below, because this vertical journey reveals the escalating stakes of the breaking in a way that abstract description cannot. The level of the reservoir is not just a number, it is a measure of how close the system is to catastrophe, and each stage of the decline brings new and more serious dangers. Begin at the high water mark, the level the reservoir reached in its fuller days, now recorded in the pale band of bleached rock that rings the canyon walls high above the current surface. This band, the so-called bathtub ring, is the mineral stain left on the rock by the water that once stood there, a ghostly record of the reservoir's former fullness. The height of this ring above the present waterline is a stark visual measure of how much the reservoir has fallen, a line drawn on the stone marking the distance between the abundance of the past and the scarcity of the present. To see it is to understand, in an instant, the sheer quantity of water that has vanished from the reservoir. Descend from that high mark, down through the exposed rock, and you pass through the levels at which the reservoir functioned normally for much of its history, the comfortable range in which the system operated with a healthy margin of stored water. As the waterline falls through this range, the reservoir loses an enormous quantity of its stored volume. The decline is not merely a matter of the surface dropping. It represents the draining of the great savings account that was supposed to buffer the system against drought. With each stage of the descent, the buffer grows thinner, the margin of safety shrinks, and the system moves closer to the point where the decline begins to impair its basic functions. Continue downward, and you approach the first of the critical thresholds, the level at which the generation of electricity begins to be affected. The great dam that holds back the reservoir also produces power, using the force of the water to drive its machinery, and this power depends on the water level being high enough to operate the generators effectively. As the reservoir falls past certain levels, the production of electricity is diminished, and eventually the capacity to generate power at all comes into question. This is a serious threshold, because the electricity produced at the dam serves a great many people, and its loss would remove a source of power that the region depends upon. The falling waterline, in other words, threatens not just the water supply, but the energy supply, compounding the danger. Descend further still, past the level that threatens the power generation, and you approach the deepest and most frightening threshold of all, the level known as dead pool. This is the point at which the water in the reservoir falls so low that it can no longer pass through the dam, the level below which the water becomes trapped, unable to flow downstream to the users who depend on it. If the reservoir were to fall to dead pool, the consequences would be catastrophic, because the water below the outlets would be effectively stranded, and the delivery of water through the dam would cease. This is the ultimate failure, the nightmare scenario that haunts the entire system, the point at which the reservoir, for all practical purposes, stops functioning as a source of supply. The falling waterline is a descent toward this abyss, and every foot of decline brings the system closer to the edge. To descend the waterline in imagination is to feel the mounting danger, to understand that the breaking is not a distant abstraction, but a real and accelerating movement toward thresholds that must not be crossed. Hashtag the 40 million who depend on it is easy, when speaking of reservoirs and river flows and water levels, to lose sight of what is truly at stake, which is not an abstraction, but the lives and livelihoods of a vast number of human beings. The water of the Colorado, captured and stored in Lake Mead and the other reservoirs of the system, sustains a population of tens of millions of people across a wide swath of the American Southwest, and the breaking of the system threatens every one of them. To understand the crisis fully, we have to understand the sheer scale of the human dependence on this water, the multitude of people whose daily existence is bound up with the health of the river and the reservoir. Consider the reach of the water. It flows to great cities scattered across the desert, sustaining the daily life of millions who may never think about where their water comes from. It flows to sprawling suburbs and smaller towns, to communities that have grown up across the region on the strength of the reliable supply. It supports the businesses and industries that employ the people of the region, the economic activity that depends, like everything else, on the availability of water, the entire fabric of modern life across this enormous area. The homes and the jobs and the services and the daily routines of tens of millions of people rests on the foundation of the water that the system provides. When we speak of the system breaking, we are speaking of a threat to all of this, to the water security of an entire civilization built in the desert. The dependence is so complete and so taken for granted that its fragility is easy to overlook. For the people who live in the region, the water simply arrives, flowing from the tap whenever it is needed, a constant and reliable presence that requires no thought. But this very reliability breeds a dangerous complacency, a failure to appreciate that the water is not guaranteed, that it depends on a system now under severe strain, that the abundance could falter. The people who depend on the water have built their lives on the assumption that it will always be there, and the breaking of the system threatens to shatter that assumption in the most fundamental way. What makes the situation especially serious is that the population dependent on the water has continued to grow even as the supply has declined. The desert Southwest has been one of the fastest growing regions of the country, its cities expanding rapidly, drawing ever more people to a landscape whose water supply is already stretched beyond its sustainable limits. This growth compounds the crisis, adding more demand to a system that already promises more than it can deliver. The collision between a growing population and a shrinking water supply is at the center of the crisis, a fundamental contradiction that cannot be sustained indefinitely, and that must, sooner or later, be resolved, either by choice or by catastrophe. Hashtag the farms that feed a nation. Among all the users of the Colorado's water, none consumes more than agriculture, and the threat to the region's farms is one of the most consequential dimensions of the breaking, with implications that extend far beyond the Southwest to the food supply of the entire nation. A great share of the water drawn from the river goes not to the cities, but to the fields, to the vast expanses of irrigated farmland that the water has made productive, and these farms are among the most important in the country, growing an enormous quantity of the food that fills the nation's tables. The breaking of the water system, therefore, is not just a threat to the people of the region, but a threat to the food supply of everyone who eats what those farms produce. The transformation of the desert into farmland is one of the most remarkable achievements of the whole water system. In its natural state, the arid land of the region could support only sparse and hardy vegetation, far too dry for the intensive agriculture that feeds a modern nation. But with the water of the Colorado delivered through an elaborate network of canals, that same land was made to bloom, becoming some of the most productive farmland anywhere. The combination of fertile soil, abundant sunshine, and delivered water proved extraordinarily productive, and the region became a major source of the nation's food, growing a significant portion of certain crops, particularly the fruits and vegetables that require a long, warm growing season. But this agricultural abundance is entirely dependent on the water, and it consumes the water in enormous quantities. Because irrigating crops in the desert requires a great deal of it, the farms are, by far, the largest users of the river's water, drawing the majority of what the system delivers, and this makes them acutely vulnerable to the breaking. When the water supply is reduced, when the allocations must be cut to match the shrinking river, agriculture is squarely in the crosshairs, because it uses so much of the water that any significant reduction in supply must inevitably involve cuts to farming. The farms that feed the nation are the biggest consumers of a resource that is running short, and that makes them the focus of the difficult decisions about who must use less. The consequences of cutting the water to agriculture would be severe. For the farmers themselves, a reduction in water means a reduction in what they can grow, a threat to their livelihoods and to the rural communities that depend on farming. Fields may have to be left unplanted, and the agricultural economy of the region, built over generations on the foundation of the delivered water, could be devastated. But the effects would not stop at the borders of the region, because the food these farms produce is consumed across the nation, and a significant reduction in their output could affect the availability and the price of food far beyond the Southwest. The breaking of the water system thus reaches into the food supply of the entire country. A reminder that the crisis of Lake Mead is not a local matter, but one with national implications. There is a difficult question at the heart of the agricultural dimension of the crisis. Because agriculture uses so much of the water, it is the obvious place to look for reductions when the supply must be cut, and there are those who argue that farming, especially of water-intensive crops in the desert, is an inefficient use of an increasingly precious resource. But agriculture is also essential, producing the food that people need, supporting rural communities and a way of life, and contributing importantly to the food security of the nation. The tension between the need to reduce water use and the value of what the water produces is one of the central dilemmas of the crisis, and it has no easy resolution. The farms that feed the nation are both the largest users of the endangered water and among its most important, and deciding their fate in an era of scarcity is one of the hardest challenges the breaking presents. Hashtag, the cities in the balance alongside the farms stand the cities, the great urban centers that have risen in the desert on the strength of the delivered water, and their fate too hangs in the balance as the system breaks. These cities represent one of the most striking features of the modern Southwest, sprawling metropolitan areas that have grown to enormous size in places that, without the imported water, could never have supported such populations. They are monuments to the same audacious dream that built the dams and the canals, testaments to the belief that with enough water delivered from afar, human beings could build great cities anywhere, even in the driest of deserts. And now, as the water supply falters, These cities face a threat to the very foundation of their existence. The growth of the desert cities has been extraordinary, their populations expanding rapidly over the decades, their skylines rising where once there was only desert. This growth was made possible entirely by the water, by the reliable supply that removed the ancient constraint on settlement in the region. With the water assured, the cities could grow without apparent limit, drawing millions of residents to a landscape that could never have sustained them on its own natural resources. The cities became emblems of a new kind of civilization, one that transcended the limits of its environment through the mastery of water, and their prosperity seemed to prove that the desert could indeed be conquered. But this urban growth, like the agricultural abundance, rests entirely on the continued delivery of the water, and the breaking of the system threatens it at its root. If that supply were to falter, the consequences would be grave, because the cities have no natural alternative, no local source that could replace the imported water on which they depend. A city of millions in the desert cannot simply find its water elsewhere if the great system fails. It is bound to the river and the reservoir, its future dependent on the water continuing to flow. The breaking of the system is therefore an existential concern for the desert cities, a threat to the foundation on which their entire existence is built. The cities have not been passive in the face of this threat, and it is important to recognize the efforts many have made to secure their water future. Faced with the growing scarcity, many urban areas have worked to use their water more efficiently, to reduce waste, and to support their populations with less water per person. Some have invested in recycling and reuse, in capturing and treating water so that it can be used more than once, and in encouraging their residents to use less, replacing thirsty landscaping with desert-appropriate plants, and adopting a range of conservation measures. These efforts have had real effects, allowing some cities to grow while holding their water use in check. And they demonstrate that urban water demand can be managed and reduced in ways that ease the pressure on the system. But conservation, however valuable, has its limits, and it cannot by itself solve the fundamental problem of a supply that is shrinking faster than demand can be reduced. The cities can use their water more efficiently, but they cannot conjure water that does not exist. And if the river continues to decline, even the most conservation-minded city will eventually face hard limits on the water available to it. The urban efforts to save water are essential, part of any real solution to the crisis, but they are not a complete answer, and the cities remain deeply vulnerable to the breaking of the larger system. Their fate hangs in the balance, dependent not only on their own efforts, but on the health of the river, the level of the reservoir, and the success or failure of the region's attempts to bring its demands into line with the shrinking supply. The great desert cities, for all their size and prosperity, are perched on a foundation of water that is eroding beneath them, and their future is bound up with the outcome of the crisis. Hashtag the fight over who loses first. As the water supply shrinks and the promises exceed the reality, the region is forced to confront the most difficult question of all, the question of who must lose, who must give up water in order to bring the system's demands into line with what the river can provide. This question lies at the heart of the crisis, and the struggle to answer it has become a bitter and consequential fight, a conflict among the many parties who depend on the water, each seeking to protect its own share, each reluctant to be the one to sacrifice. The fight over who loses first is one of the defining features of the breaking, and its outcome will shape the future of the entire region. The roots of the conflict lie in the over-allocation, in the fundamental fact that the total demands exceed the supply, so that not everyone can have all the water they were promised. Bringing the system into balance requires taking water away from someone, but the water is divided among many parties, the various states of the region. The cities and the farms, the different classes of users, and each has built its life and economy around the water it expects to receive. Every reduction imposes real pain, and so every party naturally resists, arguing that others should bear the cuts, that its own needs are essential. The result is a contentious struggle over how to distribute the losses, a fight that pits the users against one another in a competition for a shrinking resource. The conflict is complicated by the elaborate structure of rules and priorities that governs the water, a system that determines who has the strongest claim and who is most vulnerable to cuts. Under this structure, some users hold senior rights that entitle them to their water before others, while some hold junior rights that are the first to be reduced when the supply falls short. The differences in these priorities mean that the burden of the cuts does not fall evenly, and this inequality is itself a source of conflict, as those facing the deepest cuts resist their fate and those protected by seniority defend their advantages. The legal structure that was meant to govern the sharing of the water becomes, in a time of scarcity, a battleground. The stakes of the fight are enormous because the outcome will determine which communities and industries thrive and which decline, which farms keep their water and which go dry, which cities can continue to grow and which face limits. The allocation of the pain, the decision about who loses first and who loses most, is a decision about the future of the entire region. This is why the fight is so bitter and so difficult, because the water is the foundation of everything, and losing it means losing the basis of one's livelihood and way of life. The parties fight hard because they have so much to lose. Yet for all the bitterness of the fight, there is a sobering truth that hangs over it, which is that the alternative to reaching an agreement is far worse for everyone. If the parties cannot agree on how to share the shortage, then the system could collapse in a way that harms all of them, a disorderly failure in which the water is not shared, but seized, in which the outcome is determined by conflict rather than cooperation. The breaking of the human arrangements around the water would be a catastrophe surpassing even the physical decline of the reservoir, and it is the shadow of this catastrophe that drives the parties, however reluctantly, toward the negotiating table. The fight over who loses first is real and fierce, but beneath it lies the shared knowledge that all must lose something, and that the only alternative to a negotiated sacrifice is a disaster that would spare no one. Hashtag the river below the dam and the living world, the breaking of the system, is a crisis for the human beings who depend on the water, but it is also a crisis for the natural world, for the river itself and the living things that depend on it. And this ecological dimension is an important and often overlooked part of the story. The Colorado is not merely a supply of water for human use. It is a living river, or it was, a great ecosystem that supported a rich array of life along its length and that sustained the lands and waters through which it flowed. The taming of the river and the breaking of the system have profound consequences for this natural world, consequences that add another layer of loss to the crisis. The building of the great dams and the capturing of the water fundamentally altered the river, transforming it from a wild, free-flowing watercourse into a controlled and regulated system. The dams changed the river's flow, its temperature, its sediment, and its whole character, disrupting the natural patterns that the river's ecosystem had evolved with over ages. Below the dams, the river became a different thing, its floods tamed, its rhythms altered. The consequences for the river's native life were severe. As species adapted to the wild river struggled to survive in the transformed conditions, and the ecological richness that the river once supported was diminished. The very act of capturing the water for human use imposed a heavy cost on the living river. The most dramatic sign of the river's ecological plight is what has happened at its end, far downstream, where the Colorado once flowed into the sea. In its natural state, the river carried its water all the way to the Gulf, sustaining a rich delta ecosystem where the fresh water met the sea, a vast wetland teeming with life. But as more and more of the river's water was captured and diverted for human use, less and less reached the end of its course. Until in most years, the river no longer reaches the sea at all. The once thriving delta has largely dried up, its wetlands shrunken, its wildlife diminished, a stark testament to the degree to which the river has been consumed. The river that once ran to the sea now, in most years, simply disappears, exhausted by the demands placed upon it. As the crisis deepens, the pressure on the river's remaining ecological health only intensifies, because in a time of scarcity, the water needed to sustain the natural world competes directly with the water demanded for human use. When there is not enough to go around, the claims of the ecosystem, of the fish and the wildlife, and the natural processes of the river are easily overridden by the more powerful claims of the cities and the farms. The living river, already diminished by the capturing of its water, faces further loss as the shrinking supply is fought over by human users. The breaking of the system thus threatens not only the human civilization built on the water, but the natural world that the water was taken from, adding an ecological tragedy to the human crisis. There is a deeper lesson in the fate of the living river, a reminder of the true cost of the whole enterprise of taming the Colorado. The audacious dream of capturing the river was never without cost, and one of the greatest costs was the sacrifice of the wild river and the life it sustained. The living world of the Colorado is a casualty of the crisis, its decline bound up with the breaking of the system, and its plight is a part of the story that deserves to be remembered. A reminder that the water on which so much depends was taken from a living river that has paid dearly for the taking. Hashtag, can the breaking be stopped faced with the mounting crisis, the falling reservoir? The shrinking river, the straining agreements, the inevitable question arises of whether the breaking can be stopped, whether the system can be saved, and what it would take to do so. This is the question on which the future of the region depends, and while the challenge is immense, it is not entirely hopeless, because there are things that can be done. Responses that can slow the breaking and perhaps, if pursued with sufficient determination, avert the worst outcomes. Understanding these possibilities and their limits is essential to a clear-eyed view of the crisis. The most fundamental response is to reduce the demand for water, to bring the total use into line with the shrinking supply, and this is the heart of any real solution. Because the crisis stems from the fact that the demands exceed the supply, and since the supply is largely beyond human control, dependent on the river and the climate, the burden falls on reducing the demand. This means using less water across all the sectors that depend on it, and in some cases accepting that certain uses must be curtailed. The reduction of demand can take many forms, from improving the efficiency of irrigation and urban water use, to reducing the cultivation of the most water-intensive crops, to encouraging conservation throughout the region. These efforts, pursued vigorously, can significantly reduce the total demand and ease the pressure on the system. There are also efforts to manage the system more wisely, to squeeze more value from the water that is available, and to operate the reservoirs in ways that reduce the risk of catastrophic failure. This includes measures to reduce the loss of water to evaporation and inefficiency, and to coordinate the operation of the reservoirs to protect the critical thresholds. It includes efforts to develop alternative sources of water, to recycle and reuse, and to find new supplies that can supplement the river, though these alternatives face their own limits and costs. And it includes the difficult work of reforming the agreements that govern the water, of updating the rules to reflect the reality of the shrinking supply. All of these measures, taken together, represent the toolkit available for confronting the crisis. But it must be said clearly that these responses, however valuable, face enormous challenges, and there is no guarantee that they will be sufficient. The reduction of demand requires imposing real sacrifices on people who depend on the water, and the political difficulty of doing so, of deciding who must use less and by how much, is immense. The reform of the agreements requires the many contending parties to reach consensus on how to share the pain, a task that has proven extraordinarily difficult given the depth of the conflicts and the magnitude of the stakes. The alternative sources of water are limited and costly, unable to replace more than a fraction of what the river provides. And above all, the responses must contend with the possibility that the drying is permanent, that the supply will continue to shrink, so that even successful reductions in demand may be overtaken by further declines in the river. The challenge, in other words, is not static, but moving, and the responses must not merely close the current gap, but keep pace with a supply that may keep falling. The honest assessment, then, is that the breaking can perhaps be slowed, and its worst consequences perhaps averted, but only through a response of extraordinary scope and determination, a fundamental reckoning with the reality of the region's limits. Saving the system would require the parties to set aside their conflicts and share the sacrifice, to reduce their demands dramatically and permanently, to reform the arrangements that govern the water, and to accept that the era of abundance is over and the future must be built on a foundation of scarcity. It would require, in short, a transformation in how the region thinks about and uses its water, a shift from the assumption of endless supply to the reality of hard limits. Whether the region can accomplish this transformation, whether it can summon the will and the cooperation that the crisis demands, is the open question on which everything depends. The breaking can be stopped, in principle, but only if the region rises to a challenge greater than any it has faced before. Hashtag the warning of the falling water we come, at last. To the deepest meaning of the crisis of the Lake Mead River, to what the breaking of this great system tells us not only about the desert Southwest, but about the larger relationship between human beings and the natural world on which they depend. The falling water of Lake Mead, the bleached rock of the canyon walls, the shrinking river, and the straining agreements, all of it is a warning. A lesson written in the starkest terms about the limits of what human beings can demand from nature, and about what happens when a civilization builds itself on a foundation that cannot last. The story of the Lake Mead River is, at its core, a story about the collision between human ambition and natural reality. The audacious dream that built the system was a dream of transcending limits, of using human ingenuity to overcome the constraints of a harsh environment, of making the desert support a civilization it could never have sustained on its own. And for a time, the dream seemed to succeed brilliantly, the water flowing, the cities rising, the desert blooming. But the dream was built on an illusion, on the assumption that the river would provide more than it could, on the belief that the abundance was limitless, when in truth it was borrowed, drawn from reserves that could not be replenished and promised on the basis of a supply that did not exist. The breaking is what happens when the illusion meets reality, when the borrowed abundance runs out and the true limits reassert themselves. It is the reckoning that always comes, sooner or later, when human demands exceed what nature can sustainably provide. This is a lesson that reaches far beyond the desert Southwest, because the pattern it reveals is not unique to this one river or this one region. Around the world, human civilizations have built themselves on the assumption of abundant resources, drawing on the bounty of nature as though it were inexhaustible, and around the world. That assumption is increasingly being tested as the limits become apparent. The crisis of the Lake Mead River is a particularly clear example of the challenge of living within the limits of what nature can provide, of building a way of life that can be sustained rather than one that consumes its foundation. What is happening at Lake Mead is a warning of what can happen anywhere that human beings take more than nature can give. The role of the changing climate in the crisis deepens the warning and extends its reach, because the drying that has driven the breaking appears to be bound up with the broader warming that is reshaping conditions across the planet. If the reduction in the river's flow is indeed driven in significant part by rising temperatures, then the crisis of Lake Mead is a local manifestation of a global phenomenon, an early and severe example of the way that a warming climate can disrupt the water systems on which human societies depend. And if that is so, then the breaking of the Lake Mead River is a preview of challenges that may come to many other places as the warming continues, a glimpse of a future in which the water supplies that civilizations have relied upon become less reliable, in which the assumptions of the past no longer hold, in which the relationship between human beings and water must be fundamentally rethought. The falling water of Lake Mead is a warning not just for the Southwest, but for a warming world. And so the great reservoir, with its bleached rock and its shrinking waters, stands as a monument not only to human ambition, but to human limits, a reminder that even the most impressive achievements of engineering and ingenuity cannot escape the fundamental constraints of the natural world. The Lake Mead River is starting to break because it was asked to give more than it could, because a civilization was built on the assumption of an abundance that could not last, and because the reality of a shrinking supply has finally caught up with the promises of the past. Whether the region can respond, whether it can bring its demands into line with what the river can provide, whether it can build a sustainable future on the foundation of scarcity rather than the illusion of abundance, remains to be seen. But the warning is clear, written on the walls of the canyon in the pale band of stone that marks how far the water has fallen. The lifeline of the desert Southwest is failing, and its failure is a lesson for us all, a reminder that the natural world has limits, that those limits cannot be wished away, and that a civilization that ignores them does so at its peril. The falling